Dr. Marcus Chen had spent 15 years studying reptiles in the remote mountains of northern Myanmar, but nothing had prepared him for what he discovered that foggy morning in March. The local villagers had whispered stories about the giant lizards living in the ancient caves above their settlement, but Marcus always dismissed these tales as folklore mixed with fear. The breakthrough came when his research team was tracking a rare species of gecko through the limestone cliffs. His assistant, Zoe, was the first to spot the unusual markings carved into the rock face near a hidden cave entrance. The symbols were unlike anything they had seen before, resembling scales and wings etched deep into the stone by countless generations. As they approached the cave mouth, a low rumbling sound echoed from within the darkness. Marcus felt his heart racing as he realized this was no ordinary animal call. The sound was too deep, too resonant, and carried an intelligence that made the hair on his arms stand up. His portable seismic equipment detected vibrations that suggested something massive was moving inside the cave system. The village elder, Thant, arrived at their campsite that evening with urgent warnings. His weathered face was etched with genuine concern as he spoke in broken English about the Great Mother who lived in the sacred caves. According to Thant, his grandfather had been the last person to see the creature and survive, and that was over 60 years ago. Thant explained that the villagers had maintained a careful distance from the caves for generations, leaving offerings of fish and livestock at a safe distance. In return, the creature had never bothered their community. The arrangement had worked perfectly until now, but Thant could sense that something had changed in recent weeks. The signs were everywhere once Marcus knew what to look for. Unusual scorch marks on trees near the cave entrance, massive claw marks gouged into rocks 20 feet above the ground, and most disturbing of all, the complete absence of other wildlife in the immediate area. Even the birds avoided flying over the cave system. Marcus faced an impossible decision. His scientific training demanded investigation, but the warnings from the villagers carried the weight of generations of wisdom. As he stood at the edge of the camp that night, staring up at the dark cave entrance illuminated by moonlight, he knew that his life was about to change forever. The next morning brought an unexpected discovery that would make retreat impossible. Fresh tracks led from the cave entrance down toward the valley, but these weren't the tracks of one creature. The mud revealed the unmistakable imprints of smaller feet, clearly belonging to juveniles or hatchlings. Marcus realized with growing excitement and terror that he wasn't dealing with just one ancient creature, but an entire family. The implications were staggering. If these were truly dragons, as the local legends suggested, then he was looking at the discovery of the century. But if the villagers were right about the danger, he might not live to share his findings with the world. His team gathered around the tracks, measuring and photographing every detail. The smaller prints showed clear evidence of wing development and scales, confirming that these were indeed the offspring of whatever massive creature lived in the caves above. But what worried Marcus most was the direction the tracks were heading. The hatchlings had ventured down toward the village during the night, possibly searching for food or exploring their territory. This behavior change suggested that something was driving them from their usual habitat, and Marcus suspected that his team's presence might be the cause. The mother dragon was likely aware of the human intrusion and was teaching her young to expand their hunting grounds. As the morning sun climbed higher, Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Despite every warning, despite every instinct screaming at him to retreat, he chose to follow the tracks. The scientific opportunity was too great to abandon, and the thought of these magnificent creatures potentially disappearing back into legend was unbearable. His team was divided. Zoe supported his decision, driven by the same scientific curiosity that had brought them to this remote location. But their local guide, Nying, refused to take another step toward the caves. The fear in his eyes was genuine and absolute as he packed his belongings and prepared to return to the village immediately. Before leaving, Nying pulled Marcus aside for one final warning. In hushed tones, he described what his own grandfather had witnessed as a child. The great mother dragon was not just a predator, but a creature of ancient intelligence that could sense human emotions and intentions. She had tolerated the villagers because they showed proper respect, but outsiders who approached with aggressive or greedy intentions never returned. Marcus assured Nying that his intentions were purely scientific, but the guide just shook his head sadly. According to the legends, the dragon could see into a person's heart, and she would know that Marcus intended to study her, possibly capture her offspring, and reveal her existence to the outside world. In the dragon's ancient mind, these intentions were no different from those of a hunter. As Nying disappeared down the mountain path, Marcus turned his attention back to the tracks. The hatchlings had stopped at a small stream about halfway between the cave and the village, apparently drinking and playing in the water. The mud around the stream told a story of young creatures testing their abilities, practicing flight and learning to hunt small fish. But most intriguingly, the track showed that the hatchlings had lingered in this spot for hours as if waiting for something or someone. Marcus began to suspect that this wasn't random exploration, but a deliberate test or lesson orchestrated by their mother. The great dragon was teaching her young about the world beyond their cave, and Marcus had unwittingly become part of that education. The first direct encounter happened 3 days later, just as the morning mist began to lift from the valley. Marcus had positioned himself behind a large boulder near the stream, hoping to observe the hatchlings if they returned. His patience was rewarded when he heard the soft sound of wings cutting through the humid air. 2 young dragons emerged from the forest canopy, their scales shimmering with an iridescent quality that seemed to shift between deep green and bronze in the filtered sunlight. They were roughly the size of large dogs, but their movements carried a grace and intelligence that set them apart from any animal Marcus had ever studied. The hatchlings moved with purpose toward the stream, but instead of simply drinking, they began what appeared to be a complex ritual. They arranged small stones in careful patterns along the water's edge, occasionally looking up toward the cave entrance as if seeking approval from an unseen observer. Marcus held his breath as he activated his camera, desperately trying to capture footage that would prove the existence of these incredible creatures. But as soon as the camera's lens focused on them, both hatchlings stopped their activities and turned directly toward his hiding spot. Their eyes held an unsettling intelligence, and Marcus realized with growing unease that they had known he was there all along. Rather than fleeing, the hatchlings approached his boulder with curious confidence. The larger of the two, distinguished by a distinctive crest of silver scales along its head, came within arm's reach of Marcus's position. It tilted its head in a decidedly bird-like manner, studying the human intruder with obvious fascination. The interaction lasted only minutes, but it fundamentally changed Marcus's understanding of what he was dealing with. These weren't simply large reptiles operating on instinct. The hatchlings demonstrated problem-solving abilities, social coordination, and most remarkably, what appeared to be genuine curiosity about humans. When the encounter ended, it was the dragons who chose to leave, not because they were frightened, but because some unheard signal called them back toward the cave. As they took flight, Marcus noticed that their wing patterns were completely unlike any known species, featuring membrane structures that seemed to manipulate air currents in impossible ways. Back at his camp, Marcus reviewed the footage with growing excitement and concern. The video clearly showed intelligent behavior that challenged every assumption about reptilian cognition, but more troubling was what the camera had captured in the background during the encounter. A massive shadow had passed over the canopy several times while Marcus was focused on the hatchlings. The shadow was far too large to belong to any known bird, and its shape suggested something with an enormous wingspan circling overhead. The mother dragon had been watching the entire interaction, close enough to intervene instantly if she perceived any threat to her offspring. Zoe enhanced the audio from the recording, revealing low-frequency sounds that human ears couldn't detect during the actual encounter. These subsonic communications appeared to be coming from the direction of the cave, suggesting that the mother dragon had been in constant contact with her young throughout their meeting with Marcus. The implications were staggering. The hatchlings hadn't stumbled upon Marcus by accident. They had been sent to evaluate him, to determine his intentions and capabilities. The entire encounter had been orchestrated by an intelligence that was assessing whether the human presence posed a threat to their family. That night, Marcus made the decision that would define the rest of his expedition. Instead of maintaining his distant observation post, he chose to move his camp closer to the cave system. The scientific opportunity was too valuable to approach with half measures, and the dragon's apparent tolerance of his presence suggested that direct study might be possible. The villagers' reaction to this news was immediate and alarmed. Thant arrived at dawn with a group of elders, all pleading with Marcus to reconsider his decision. They brought with them ancient texts written on palm leaves, containing detailed descriptions of previous encounters with the cave dragons. According to these historical accounts, the dragons had occasionally allowed humans to approach when those humans demonstrated proper respect and brought appropriate offerings. But the texts also contained warnings about the consequences of overstaying welcome or showing any signs of aggression or greed. One account, translated by the village teacher, described a British expedition from the colonial period that had attempted to capture a dragon hatchling for transport to London. The entire group had vanished overnight, leaving behind only their equipment and clothing arranged in neat piles at the cave entrance. Despite these warnings, Marcus felt compelled to continue. The scientific importance of documenting living dragons outweighed the historical cautionary tales, and he convinced himself that his modern approach and peaceful intentions would make the difference. As his team prepared to relocate their equipment, strange things began happening around their original campsite. Their instruments registered magnetic anomalies that shouldn't exist in the local geology. Electronic devices experienced intermittent failures. Most unsettling of all, their food supplies began disappearing during the night, taken with a precision that suggested intelligent selection rather than random scavenging. The missing items weren't random. Someone or something was taking specific types of food while leaving others untouched. The pattern suggested a preference for protein-rich foods and anything with strong flavors or scents. Marcus began to suspect that the dragons were conducting their own study of human behavior and dietary habits. On their final night at the lower camp, Marcus experienced something that shook his confidence for the first time since beginning the expedition. He was awakened by the sound of heavy breathing just outside his tent. When he carefully peered through the fabric, he saw a massive eye reflecting his flashlight beam from just inches away. The eye was larger than a dinner plate, with a pupil that contracted intelligently in response to the light. But what terrified Marcus most was the obvious intelligence behind that gaze. This wasn't an animal evaluating prey. This was a sentient being making a conscious decision about whether to allow the human intruder to continue living. The encounter lasted only seconds before the creature moved away, but Marcus understood that he had just passed some kind of test. The mother dragon had come to evaluate him personally, and for reasons he couldn't fathom, she had chosen to let him live. Tomorrow he would move his camp to within a few hundred yards of her lair, and his real education about dragons would begin. The new campsite felt like stepping into another world entirely. Ancient trees formed a natural cathedral around the area, their massive trunks scarred with claw marks that told stories of countless generations of dragon inhabitants. The very air seemed different here, charged with an energy that made Marcus's scientific instruments behave erratically. Within hours of establishing their equipment, the hatchlings made their first official visit. This time there were 3 of them, including a smaller individual that Marcus hadn't seen before. They approached the camp with the confident curiosity of children exploring a new playground, showing no fear of the humans or their strange devices. The youngest hatchling, barely the size of a house cat, seemed particularly fascinated by Marcus's laptop computer. It approached the device with careful deliberation, extending one delicate claw to touch the screen. When the display responded to the contact, the young dragon jumped back with what could only be described as delighted surprise. Zoe managed to capture this interaction on film, documenting what appeared to be the first recorded instance of a dragon demonstrating technological curiosity. The implications for understanding dragon intelligence were enormous, but Marcus found himself more concerned with the practical reality of sharing his campsite with increasingly bold young predators. The hatchlings established a routine of morning and evening visits, during which they would explore the human equipment with systematic thoroughness. They seemed particularly interested in anything that produced light, sound, or movement. Marcus's motion-activated camera became a favorite toy, triggering excited chirping sounds whenever the dragons managed to activate its flash. But the visits weren't entirely playful. Marcus began to notice that the hatchlings were conducting what appeared to be intelligence-gathering operations. They would examine food supplies, test the strength of tent materials, and even attempt to manipulate zippers and buckles with their surprisingly dexterous claws. The mother dragon's presence became increasingly obvious as the days passed. Massive footprints appeared overnight around the perimeter of the camp, forming what looked like a protective circle. Trees that had been healthy the day before would be found stripped of their bark in precise patterns that seemed to serve as territorial markings. Most unsettling were the gifts that began appearing near Marcus's tent each morning. Fresh fish arranged in neat rows, unusual minerals that glowed with phosphorescent light, and strangest of all, what appeared to be carved bone artifacts depicting human figures in various poses. Marcus realized that the dragon family was attempting to communicate with him through these offerings, but understanding their meaning proved frustratingly difficult. The bone carvings were particularly puzzling, as they suggested an artistic ability and cultural complexity that challenged every assumption about reptilian intelligence. The breakthrough in communication came when Marcus decided to reciprocate the gift-giving behavior. He left offerings of his own near the cave entrance, including preserved foods from his supplies and small electronic devices like LED flashlights and digital thermometers. The response was immediate and dramatic. The mother dragon emerged from her cave in full daylight for the first time since Marcus had arrived. She was magnificent and terrifying beyond anything his imagination had prepared him for, standing nearly 15 feet tall at the shoulder with wings that seemed to block out the sun when fully extended. But rather than displaying aggression, the great dragon approached Marcus's offerings with what appeared to be ceremonial reverence. She examined each item carefully, manipulating the electronic devices with surprising gentleness until she discovered how to activate them. The sight of a creature from legend learning to operate a modern flashlight was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. The dragon's intelligence became undeniable when she began demonstrating the devices to her offspring, clearly teaching them about human technology and its capabilities. The lesson lasted over an hour, during which the entire dragon family worked together to understand the function and potential applications of each gift. Marcus watched this interaction from a distance of about 50 yards, close enough to observe clearly but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. The dragons were obviously aware of his presence but chose to include him as an audience for their learning session. It was as if they wanted him to understand their intellectual capabilities. The demonstration concluded with what Marcus could only interpret as a formal acknowledgement. The mother dragon looked directly at him across the distance separating them and performed what appeared to be a bow, lowering her massive head in a gesture that seemed loaded with meaning and intention. That evening brought the most remarkable development yet. The oldest hatchling approached Marcus's tent alone, carrying something in its mouth. When it dropped the object at his feet, Marcus discovered a smoothly polished stone carved with symbols that matched those he had seen at the cave entrance. The carving depicted what appeared to be a map of the local area, showing the cave system, the village below, and various landmarks that Marcus recognized. But most intriguingly, the map included locations that Marcus hadn't discovered yet, suggesting that the dragons wanted to guide him to specific places of importance. Zoe worked feverishly to document and interpret the carved map, comparing it with their satellite imagery and topographical surveys. The correlation was remarkably accurate, but the map also showed features that didn't appear on any modern survey, including what looked like additional cave systems and underground water sources. As night fell, Marcus realized that he had crossed a threshold in his relationship with the dragon family. They were no longer simply tolerating his presence or studying him as a curiosity. They were actively attempting to communicate complex information and seemed to expect him to respond appropriately. The weight of this responsibility was overwhelming. Marcus was participating in what might be the first genuine attempt at interspecies communication between humans and dragons, but he had no framework for understanding their expectations or cultural protocols. The carved map represented an invitation or perhaps a test, but Marcus had no way of knowing whether accepting it would lead to greater understanding or catastrophic misunderstanding. The dragons had demonstrated their intelligence and apparent goodwill, but they had also made it clear that they possessed power beyond human comprehension. As he held the carved stone in his hands that night, Marcus understood that his next decision would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the future relationship between humanity and these remarkable creatures. The hatchlings had refused to leave him alone, and now he was beginning to understand why their presence might be more blessing than curse. Marcus's decision to follow the carved map led him deeper into the mountains than any human had ventured in living memory. The path indicated by the dragon symbols wound through hidden valleys and forgotten passes, each step taking him further from the safety of known territory and deeper into a world where ancient powers still held sway. The first location, marked on the map, turned out to be a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside, its walls decorated with thousands of dragon carvings spanning what appeared to be centuries or even millennia. The artwork told a visual history of dragon civilization, depicting everything from hunting scenes to what looked like formal ceremonies and social gatherings. But the most shocking discovery was evidence of previous human contact. Mixed among the dragon carvings were clearly human figures, showing people and dragons interacting peacefully in various contexts. Some images showed humans bringing offerings. Others depicted what appeared to be collaborative activities like construction projects and agricultural work. Marcus realized he was looking at proof that dragons and humans had coexisted in this region for far longer than anyone had imagined. The village legends weren't just folklore. They were cultural memories of an ancient partnership that had somehow survived into the modern era. The Hatchlings had followed him to this sacred site, arriving shortly after he began documenting the carvings. Their behavior changed dramatically in this location, becoming more formal and restrained. They moved through the amphitheater with obvious reverence, occasionally touching specific carvings with their snouts in what appeared to be ritualistic gestures. The youngest hatchling approached one particular carving and began making soft vocalizations that Marcus had never heard before. The sounds were musical and complex, almost like singing, and seemed to be directed at a carving that depicted a human figure standing beside a large dragon with distinctive markings. As Marcus studied the carving more closely, he noticed that the dragon's markings were remarkably similar to those of the mother dragon he had encountered. The human figure was depicted holding what appeared to be a carved stone identical to the map he now carried. The implications were staggering. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't the first scientist to make contact with this dragon family. The carving suggested that this relationship had been ongoing for generations, with selected humans being chosen to serve as intermediaries or students. Marcus was following in footsteps that stretched back through centuries. The second location on the map proved even more revelatory. Hidden beneath a natural rock arch was a cave system that served as a library of sorts, filled with carved tablets and preserved artifacts that documented the long history of dragon-human cooperation in the region. Among these artifacts, Marcus found items that clearly belonged to previous human visitors. Victorian-era scientific instruments sat alongside medieval tools, and even more ancient objects whose origins he couldn't determine. Each collection was carefully preserved and displayed, suggesting that the dragons viewed these human contacts as historically significant. Most disturbing was a leather journal written in English, dated 1923, that belonged to a British naturalist named Edmund Hartwell. The journal documented Hartwell's discovery of the same dragon family Marcus was now studying, describing encounters that were remarkably similar to his own experiences. But Hartwell's journal ended abruptly with a final entry that sent chills down Marcus's spine. The naturalist wrote about being invited deeper into the mountain by the dragons, to witness something he described as the Great Revelation. He expressed excitement about finally understanding the true purpose of the human-dragon relationship, but the journal contained no details about what he had discovered. The dragons had preserved Hartwell's journal for nearly a century, along with his equipment and personal effects. The careful preservation suggested respect and remembrance, but Marcus couldn't escape the uncomfortable question of what had happened to Hartwell himself. Zoe's analysis of the journal revealed additional disturbing details. Hartwell's handwriting changed dramatically in his final entries, becoming more erratic and showing signs of extreme stress or excitement. His last few pages contained sketches that depicted dragon anatomy with impossible accuracy, suggesting he had been given access to information that no outside observer should possess. The third location on the map was the most ominous yet. A deep gorge hidden behind multiple false trails, its entrance marked by carved warnings in multiple languages, including English. The warnings were clear and unambiguous. Beyond this point lies knowledge that changes the bearer forever. Enter only if prepared to never return to your former existence. Despite the warnings, the hatchlings led Marcus directly to this location, showing no hesitation about crossing the threshold marked by the carved warnings. Their confidence suggested that this was always intended to be part of his journey, that the previous locations had been preparation for whatever lay ahead. The gorge opened into a vast underground chamber illuminated by naturally phosphorescent minerals. The walls were covered with carvings more complex and detailed than anything Marcus had seen before, depicting what appeared to be the complete life cycle and social structure of dragon civilization. But the most remarkable feature of the chamber was a series of alcoves, containing what appeared to be dragon eggs in various stages of development. The implications were overwhelming. Marcus was being shown the most sacred and vulnerable aspect of dragon society, their nursery and future generations. The mother dragon was waiting for him in this chamber, but she was not alone. 3 other adult dragons, each with distinctive markings and apparent age differences, were arranged in a formal semicircle around the egg alcoves. Marcus realized he was facing what appeared to be a dragon council or governing body. The formal nature of this encounter was unmistakable. This wasn't a chance meeting or casual observation opportunity. The dragons had deliberately guided him through a series of preparatory experiences, culminating in this formal presentation to their leadership council. As Marcus stood before the assembled dragons, holding the carved map that had led him to this moment, he understood that he had reached a point of no return. Whatever the dragons wanted to communicate to him would fundamentally change his understanding of the world and his place in it. The hatchlings positioned themselves between Marcus and the adult dragons, their body language suggesting they were serving as his advocates or sponsors in this formal gathering. Their refusal to leave him had brought him to this moment, and Marcus began to suspect that their attachment to him wasn't random, but part of a larger plan that had been in motion since his first day in the mountains. The communication that followed challenged everything Marcus thought he knew about intelligence and consciousness. The dragons didn't speak in any conventional sense, but they projected images directly into his mind with startling clarity and emotional depth. The experience was overwhelming and beautiful, like receiving a flood of memories that belonged to someone else. Through these mental projections, Marcus learned that dragons possessed a form of collective consciousness that allowed them to share experiences across generations. The mother dragon showed him memories inherited from her ancestors, stretching back thousands of years to a time when dragons and humans worked together to maintain balance in the natural world. The images revealed that dragons were not simply large reptiles, but the guardians of an ancient ecological system that maintained stability across entire mountain ranges. They controlled weather patterns through methods that seemed to blend advanced physics with what humans might call magic, ensuring that the delicate balance of life in their territory remained intact. Marcus saw through dragon eyes the slow degradation of this balance as human civilization expanded and changed. The dragons had withdrawn from direct contact with humanity not out of fear, but because human society had lost the wisdom necessary for partnership. The industrial age had brought technologies that disrupted natural systems faster than dragons could compensate. But the most shocking revelation was that dragons had been quietly working to restore this balance for decades, using their influence over natural systems to counteract human-caused environmental damage. The mysterious weather patterns that climatologists couldn't explain, the unusual stability of certain ecosystems despite global climate change, all of it was the result of dragon intervention. The Council of Elder Dragons shared with Marcus their growing concern about the accelerating pace of environmental destruction. Their traditional methods of maintaining balance were becoming insufficient against the scale of modern human impact. They needed human partners again, people who could serve as intermediaries between dragon wisdom and human technology. This was why the hatchlings had refused to leave Marcus alone. They had been sent to evaluate him as a potential bridge between their species, someone who could help establish a new form of cooperation adapted to the modern world. His scientific background and genuine respect for their intelligence made him an ideal candidate for this role. The dragons showed him visions of what cooperation could accomplish. Human technology guided by dragon understanding of natural systems could solve environmental problems that seemed impossible with either approach alone. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecological collapse could all be addressed through this partnership. But the commitment required was absolute. Anyone who accepted the role of intermediary between dragons and humans would need to dedicate their entire life to this purpose. They would gain access to knowledge and abilities that would fundamentally change their nature, making it impossible to return to a normal human existence. Marcus understood now what had happened to Edmund Hartwell and the other humans whose artifacts he had found. They hadn't died or been killed by the dragons. They had chosen to undergo a transformation that allowed them to serve as permanent liaisons between the species, gaining extended lifespans and enhanced abilities in exchange for accepting a role that isolated them from normal human society. The choice was being offered to Marcus now. The dragons could grant him the ability to survive in their environment indefinitely, to communicate with them directly, and to understand natural systems with the same intuitive clarity that dragons possessed. In return, he would become responsible for establishing and maintaining contact between dragons and the human scientific community. The weight of this decision was crushing. Accepting would mean abandoning his previous life entirely, including his relationships with family and colleagues. But refusing might mean losing the only opportunity in human history to establish a formal alliance with beings who possessed the knowledge necessary to save the planet's ecosystems. The dragons didn't pressure him for an immediate answer. Instead, they showed him one final vision that crystallized the stakes involved. Earth's climate and ecological systems were approaching a tipping point, beyond which recovery would be impossible, using human methods alone. The window for establishing dragon-human cooperation was closing rapidly. Within that vision, Marcus saw two possible futures. In one timeline, dragons remained hidden while human civilization continued its destructive path until environmental collapse made the planet uninhabitable for both species. In the other timeline, dragon-human cooperation led to revolutionary advances in environmental restoration and sustainable technology, creating a future where both species thrived. The hatchlings approached Marcus during this vision, pressing close to him with obvious affection and trust. Through the mental connection, he could feel their hope and determination. They believed in the possibility of cooperation between their species, and they had chosen him as their champion in making that dream reality. As the visions faded, Marcus found himself alone with the Dragon Council and the three hatchlings in the phosphorescent chamber. The silence was heavy with expectation but not pressure. The dragons were patient beings who understood that decisions of this magnitude required careful consideration. The eldest dragon, distinguished by silver scales that seemed to capture and reflect the chamber's natural light, approached Marcus with something held carefully in her massive claws. It was another carved stone, but this one was different from the map. The carvings depicted a human figure undergoing some kind of transformation, emerging with dragon-like characteristics while retaining human form. Marcus realized he was being shown what he would become if he accepted their offer. Not fully dragon, but no longer entirely human either. A hybrid being capable of bridging the gap between species and serving as a translator between fundamentally different forms of consciousness and understanding. The stone was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse. With its own internal energy, as Marcus held it, he could feel the potential for transformation contained within the carved symbols. The choice was literally in his hands, but he had been granted time to consider all the implications before making his final decision. The hatchlings settled around him as he contemplated this life-changing choice, their presence both comforting and quietly insistent. They had brought him to this moment through their refusal to leave him alone, and now they waited to see whether their faith in him had been justified. Marcus spent 3 days in the phosphorescent chamber, wrestling with the most important decision of his life while the Dragon Council waited with infinite patience. The hatchlings remained constantly by his side, somehow understanding that their human friend needed time to process the magnitude of what was being offered. During this time, the dragons continued to share knowledge with him through their unique form of mental communication. They showed him the intricate network of dragon families hidden across the globe, each group responsible for maintaining ecological balance in their respective regions. The scope of their hidden influence was staggering. He learned that the unusual weather patterns that had puzzled meteorologists for decades were actually coordinated efforts by dragon communities to mitigate climate damage. They had been working tirelessly to preserve crucial ecosystems, redirect destructive storm systems, and maintain biodiversity in areas that should have collapsed under environmental pressure. But the strain was showing. The eldest dragons were exhausting themselves trying to compensate for accelerating environmental destruction, Several dragon communities had already gone dormant, unable to maintain their protective influence over regions that had been damaged beyond their ability to heal. The dragons showed Marcus satellite imagery that revealed the true extent of their intervention. Green corridors that persisted despite surrounding deforestation, weather systems that consistently delivered rain to drought-stricken areas, and wildlife populations that thrived in regions where they should have gone extinct. All of it was the result of dragon stewardship. Without human partnership, this protective network would eventually fail. The dragons were long-lived but not immortal, and the young generation lacked the experience and power needed to maintain the complex systems their elders had established. They needed human allies who could work within human society to address problems at their source. On the second day, Marcus experienced a profound moment of clarity when the youngest hatchling fell ill from exposure to pollutants in the air. Despite their natural resilience, even dragons were beginning to succumb to the toxic load of modern environmental damage. The sight of the suffering young dragon crystallized the urgency of the situation. The dragons' healing methods for their sick youngster involved techniques that blended what appeared to be advanced medical knowledge with manipulation of natural forces. They used specific mineral combinations, controlled electromagnetic fields, and focused mental energy to gradually purge the toxins from the hatchling system. Watching this process, Marcus realized that dragon knowledge could revolutionize human medicine as well as environmental science. They understood biological systems at a level that surpassed current human knowledge by centuries. The potential applications for treating human diseases were limitless, but access to this knowledge came with the transformation offer. The dragons couldn't share their most advanced understanding with unchanged humans because the mental framework necessary to comprehend their methods required fundamental alterations to human consciousness and perception. On the third day, Marcus received an unexpected message from the outside world. Zoe had managed to establish radio contact from the base camp, reporting that government officials and military personnel were mobilizing in response to his expedition reports. The existence of the dragons was no longer a secret that could be contained. The implications were terrifying. If hostile forces reached the dragon sanctuary, the delicate trust that had been built over weeks of careful interaction would be shattered instantly. The dragons would be forced to defend themselves, potentially ending any chance of peaceful cooperation between the species. The Dragon Council's reaction to this news was immediate and decisive. They began preparations to evacuate their sanctuary and relocate to deeper, more hidden locations. The window of opportunity for establishing formal cooperation was closing faster than anyone had anticipated. Marcus realized that his decision could no longer be made in isolation. The choice wasn't just about his personal transformation anymore. It was about whether peaceful contact between dragons and humans would be possible at all. If he refused the transformation, he might be the last human to ever experience dragon trust. The eldest dragon approached him with what appeared to be urgency for the first time since he had entered the chamber. Through their mental connection, she conveyed the critical nature of the situation. If Marcus chose transformation, he could serve as proof to incoming human forces that cooperation was possible. If he refused, the dragons would have no choice but to disappear completely. The hatchlings seemed to sense the growing tension. They pressed closer to Marcus, their warm scales providing comfort as he grappled with a decision that would determine the future relationship between two intelligent species. Their trust in him remained absolute, even as the adult dragons prepared for potential conflict. Marcus looked at the transformation stone still clutched in his hands and understood that he was holding more than just his own future. The carved symbols seemed to pulse with increasing intensity, as if responding to the urgency of the moment and his growing emotional commitment to the dragon cause. The sounds of helicopters began to echo through the mountain valleys, confirming that military forces were indeed approaching the area. Time had run out for careful deliberation. Marcus had to choose between preserving his human identity or accepting transformation to become a bridge between worlds. The youngest hatchling, now recovered from its illness, approached Marcus and gently touched the transformation stone with its snout. The gesture was unmistakably encouraging, a final expression of faith from the creatures who had refused to leave him alone since the beginning of this incredible journey. As the helicopter sounds grew louder, Marcus made his choice. The future of two species hung in the balance, and the hatchlings had shown him that some decisions were too important to be made based on personal comfort or fear. He closed his eyes, gripped the transformation stone firmly, and activated whatever ancient process it contained. The sensation that followed was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Energy flowed through his body like liquid lightning, rewriting his cellular structure and expanding his consciousness beyond anything he had thought possible. The last thing he saw before the transformation completed was the proud, hopeful expressions of the three hatchlings who had led him to this moment. Marcus emerged from the transformation as something entirely new, a being that bridged the gap between human and dragon consciousness while retaining the essential qualities of both species. His physical form remained recognizably human, but his senses had expanded beyond anything he could have imagined, allowing him to perceive the subtle energy flows that dragons use to manipulate natural systems. The military helicopters arrived at the sanctuary just as Marcus completed his metamorphosis. Leading the expedition was General Patricia Hayes, a woman whose reputation for aggressive tactics in dealing with unknown threats made the dragons extremely nervous. She had brought a full complement of scientists, soldiers, and capture equipment based on Marcus's initial reports about discovering large reptiles. But instead of finding helpless animals to study or contain, General Hayes encountered Marcus standing calmly at the cave entrance, flanked by the three hatchlings who seemed completely unafraid of the military presence. The transformation had given Marcus an aura of quiet authority that even hardened soldiers found unsettling. Marcus addressed the military team in a voice that carried new harmonics, speaking with the combined wisdom of human science and dragon knowledge. He explained that the creatures they sought to study were not animals, but representatives of an ancient civilization that had been protecting Earth's ecosystems for millennia. The general's initial reaction was skeptical and hostile. She ordered her team to prepare tranquilizer weapons and capture nets, viewing Marcus as either delusional or somehow compromised by his extended exposure to dangerous wildlife. But her attitude changed dramatically when the mother dragon emerged from the cave system. The great dragon's appearance was even more magnificent and terrifying than Marcus remembered from his first encounter. Standing at her full height with wings partially extended, she was clearly a being of immense power and intelligence. But instead of displaying aggression, she performed the same formal bow that Marcus had witnessed weeks earlier. Through Marcus as translator, the Dragon Council offered humanity a partnership that could solve the environmental crises threatening both species. They proposed sharing their knowledge of natural systems in exchange for human technological assistance in restoration, efforts that had become too complex for dragon methods alone. General Hayes found herself in a situation completely outside her training or experience. Military protocols had no provisions for negotiating with non-human intelligences, especially ones that demonstrated abilities that seemed to transcend known physics. The dragons could manipulate weather, heal damaged ecosystems, and communicate through methods that bypassed normal sensory channels. The demonstration that followed removed any doubt about dragon capabilities. Working together, the mother dragon and her offspring restored a section of forest that had been damaged by acid rain, transforming dead trees into healthy growth within minutes. They accomplished this by manipulating soil chemistry, redirecting underground water sources, and somehow accelerating natural healing processes. Marcus served as both translator and mediator during the tense negotiations that followed. His transformation had given him the ability to understand dragon methods well enough to explain them in scientific terms that the human team could grasp. He also possessed enhanced empathic abilities that allowed him to sense and address the fears and concerns of both species. The breakthrough came when the youngest hatchling approached General Hayes directly, showing the same fearless curiosity that had first drawn it to Marcus. The dragon's obvious intelligence and gentle nature made it impossible for the general to maintain her view of these creatures as mere animals to be captured and studied. Over the course of 3 intense days, the foundation for a new relationship between humans and dragons was established. A formal treaty was drafted that recognized dragon sovereignty over certain protected territories while creating frameworks for collaborative environmental projects. Marcus found his new role as intermediary both challenging and deeply fulfilling. His transformation had granted him extended lifespan and enhanced abilities, But more importantly, it had given him the capacity to help solve problems that neither species could address alone. The hatchlings had been right to refuse to leave him, somehow sensing that he would become crucial to their species' survival. The first joint human-dragon environmental project focused on restoring the Amazon rainforest. Dragon weather control abilities combined with human reforestation technology achieved in months what would have taken decades using conventional methods. The success of this initial collaboration convinced skeptics on both sides that the partnership could work. Zoe became the first human to work directly with the transformed Marcus, helping to establish communication protocols and research methodologies that respected dragon culture while advancing human understanding. She often joked that her former colleague had become something unprecedented in the annals of science, but she never questioned his dedication to bridging the gap between worlds. The three hatchlings who had started this incredible journey grew into adult dragons under Marcus's guidance, becoming the first generation to grow up with formal human contact. They served as cultural ambassadors, helping other dragon communities overcome their traditional reluctance to reveal themselves to human society. Years later, as Marcus stood in a restored forest that existed because of dragon-human cooperation, he reflected on the moment when three young dragons had refused to leave him alone. Their persistent attachment had seemed like simple curiosity at the time, but he now understood it as the first step in a plan that spanned generations. The warnings from villagers had been correct in one sense. Approaching the dragons had indeed changed everything about Marcus's life, but the transformation had led not to destruction, but to the birth of a new age of cooperation between species that had nearly lost the chance to work together. The hatchlings, now magnificent adult dragons with offspring of their own, still visited Marcus regularly. They brought their young to meet the human who had helped bridge the gap between worlds, ensuring that future generations would understand the importance of maintaining the partnership that had saved both species from environmental catastrophe. Marcus had lost his purely human identity, but he had gained something far more valuable. He had become living proof that cooperation between different forms of consciousness was not only possible, but essential for the survival of Earth's complex ecosystems. The young dragon's refusal to leave him alone had ultimately saved two worlds.